Nobody warned the most feared man in Seoul that the most dangerous thing to ever walk into his office would be wearing a blue pinafore dress and pigtails. Nobody warned her either that the man everyone in the city crossed the street to avoid would be the only one willing to cross the room for her. Some collisions, it turns out, are not accidents. Some are corrections. The rain had been falling on Seoul for 3 days straight, which suited Kong Jae-won perfectly. Rain kept people indoors. Indoors kept them frightened, and frightened people made fewer mistakes. He appreciated the rain the way other men appreciated assistance. It managed the atmosphere, so he didn't have to. He was in the middle of dismantling a man's career, quietly, surgically, the way he did everything, when the door opened wrong. Every door in Shin Tower opened the same way. A knock, a pause, a slow, careful push by someone who had already mentally composed their apology. It was a rhythm the building ran on, like a heartbeat, and Jae-won had grown so accustomed to it that he barely noticed it anymore. What he noticed was its absence. The door didn't knock, didn't pause. It swung open with the full-body determination of someone who had never once been told that this particular door led to consequences. She was small, the kind of small that made the room feel suddenly oversized and absurd. A blue pinafore dress, damp at the hem. Brown curls bundled into a bun that had lost its argument with gravity on one side. And on her left cheek, a mark, faint, pink, recent, that told a story her age had no business starring in. 6 men reached for weapons. Jae-won raised one finger. The room stopped breathing. The girl's eyes, dark, sharp, furious with a particular moral certainty of someone who has been wronged and knows the exact coordinates of that wrong, moved across the room without hesitation. She passed over Director, like he was a chair. Passed over the 6 armed men like they were furniture. And she stopped in front of Jae-won with the gravity of a verdict. She pointed at her cheek. "That lady hit me," she said. "The one with the red shoes. I bumped her by accident and she hit me. I want you to tell her that was wrong." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in this room in months. Director Oh, who had survived 3 syndicate wars and 2 government investigations, made the fatal error of smiling. Jae-won looked at him. Just looked. The smile dissolved like paper in rain. He looked back at the girl. Something moved behind his eyes, not softness, exactly. More like recognition. The way a man looks at something he did not expect to be real. "What is your name?" he asked.
"Park Minesio," she said.
"I'm 6 3/4. And I'm not leaving until someone says sorry." Kong Jae-won had, in his 34 years, negotiated with corrupt politicians, stared down rival syndicate heads across tables that had seen blood, and once sat in a government interrogation room for 11 hours without requesting water, a lawyer, or a change of expression.
He was not a man who was moved by things. And yet,
he stood, buttoned his jacket. One button, the single motion his men had learned to read the way sailors read weather, and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Clear the room." Director Oh opened his mouth. "Including you," Jae-won said. The room emptied with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the instruction was not a request and that the alternative to compliance was a life philosophy they were not prepared to adopt tonight. Within 40 seconds, the only people remaining in the most heavily secured office in Gangnam were a Korean Mafia boss worth more than most small nations and a 6 3/4-year-old girl in a damp dress. Minesio watched them leave with the satisfied expression of someone whose meeting request had finally been accepted. Jae-won pulled a chair from the side of the room. Not his chair, a visitor's chair, and set it in front of his desk so that when he sat, he was closer to her height. It was the kind of small, deliberate gesture that his men would have found alarming if they'd witnessed it, because it meant he was choosing to be approachable, and Kong Jae-won was not, as a rule, approachable.
"Sit," he said.
"I'm okay standing."
He almost said something.
Decided against it. "Tell me exactly what happened." Minesio told him. She was precise in the way children are precise when they know they are right. No embellishment, no drama, just the clean architecture of events laid out in sequence. She had been looking for her mother. She had turned the corner. She had bumped the lady with the red shoes. The wine had spilled. And it wasn't even my fault. I didn't touch the glass. And then the lady had hit her. Open palm.
Right cheek.
Jae-won listened without interrupting. This alone would have astonished his men, because Jaewon interrupted everyone. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You came here," he said, "instead of finding your mother." "My mom would cry," Minasio said simply. "And then she'd apologize to everyone even though we didn't do anything wrong. She does that."
A pause.
"I don't do that." There it was again. That thing behind his eyes. "No," he said. "I can see that." He reached across the desk, not touching her face, but looking at the mark on her cheek with the careful attention of someone cataloging an injustice. His jaw tightened, barely a millimeter, but in the language of Kang Jaewon's face, it was the equivalent of a declaration of war. He pressed the intercom. "Bring Yuri to the corridor outside my office," he said.
Now.
Shin Yuri had spent the last 14 months perfecting the art of being Kang Jaewon's woman. Not his wife. She was pragmatic enough to understand that particular title was not currently on the table, but his woman. The distinction, in her mind, carried its own gravity, its own passport, its own permission to move through Shin Tower like she had a deed to the place tucked inside her designer clutch. She had cultivated the role with the discipline of a professional. She knew which restaurants he preferred and which he tolerated. She knew not to speak during the first 30 minutes after he returned from meetings. She knew how to arrange herself in a room so that she was noticed without appearing to try. These were skills, real ones, and she had deployed them faithfully for over a year. What she had not cultivated was judgment. She was in the East Corridor, phone pressed to her ear, relaying the wine incident to her friend Chiron with the aggrieved energy of the wronged party. "It ruined my blouse, Chiron, the silk one, and the child just came flying around the corner like a small disaster." When the intercom in the hallway clicked and she heard his voice. "Bring Yuri to the corridor outside my office."
Now.
She lowered the phone slowly. Now was a word Jaewon used rarely. When he used it, it meant the window for casual interpretation had already closed. She told Chiron she would call back. She smoothed her dress, black, elegant, armor in the only war she knew how to fight, checked her reflection in the darkened glass of a framed painting, and walked toward his office with her chin at the precise angle she had decided projected both confidence and innocence simultaneously. She had practiced this angle. It had worked before. The corridor outside his office was empty except for 2 guards, standing with the animated personality of lampposts, and Jaewon himself, who was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets in the deceptively relaxed posture of a man who has already decided everything and is merely waiting for the other party to arrive at the conversation he has prepared for them. "Jaewon," she said warmly. Warm was the right register. Warm said, "I am not worried, because I have done nothing that reasonable people would consider serious." He looked at her for a moment, without speaking. This was normal. She waited. "The child," he said. The mark on her face. Yuri exhaled, carefully, quietly. "It was an accident. She ran into me. The wine went everywhere. I reacted. It was a reflex, not. You hit a 6-year-old girl." "I barely. In my building." His voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It never did. That was the thing about Jaewon's anger that people consistently failed to prepare for. It did not arrive loud. It arrived final. Yuri opened her mouth. "Collect your things," he said. The corridor, at that moment, felt significantly longer than it had 60 seconds ago. "Jaewon. Every item. Every room. Tonight." And if you're watching this and thinking Yuri deserved exactly what she got, comment "red shoes, wrong move" below. Because some people only understand consequence when it walks out of a room with its jacket buttoned. Like and subscribe if you believe no child, regardless of who their mother works for, should ever be made to feel small. Only people who think power excuses cruelty won't. Yuri stood in the corridor for a long moment after he turned and walked back inside. The guards did not look at her. They had been trained not to look at things that were no longer relevant. She looked at the closed door, then at her red shoes, then at the city burning quietly through the window at the end of the hall. She had miscalculated. Not the child. The child was incidental. She had miscalculated him. She had spent 14 months studying Kang Jaewon's preferences and somehow missed the most important one. He did not forgive people who punish the powerless. She picked up her clutch, and she walked. Park Soo-yeon was on her knees scrubbing the grout between the tiles of the 13th floor bathroom when her supervisor, Mr. Beck, appeared in the doorway with the specific expression of a man delivering news he did not entirely understand, but was reasonably certain was above his pay grade. "Someone from Mr. Kang's office is asking for you," he said. Soo-yeon sat back on her heels. The brush in her hand dripped quietly onto the tile. In 2 years of cleaning this building, nobody from Mr. Kang's office had ever asked for anything from her except that the floors be dry before 6 and the glass partitions be streak-free. She was good at both. She had never given anyone a reason to look for her, which meant someone else had. She knew before she stood up. The way mothers know. Not through logic, not through evidence, but through that specific frequency of dread that hums at the base of the throat when a child is involved. "Minesio," she said. Not a question. Mr. Beck blinked. They didn't say." She was already pulling off her rubber gloves. She found them on the 14th floor, in a small anteroom adjoining the main office, a space she had cleaned 100 times and never once sat in. Minesio was in an enormous leather chair that swallowed her small frame completely, eating a triangle kimbap that someone had produced from somewhere, holding it with both hands with the focused contentment of a child who has resolved her grievances and moved on to more important matters. Jae-won was standing near the window, jacket still buttoned, watching the city. He turned when Soo-yeon entered. She looked at Minesio first, took inventory, the mark on her cheek, the slightly lopsided bun, the kimbap, and felt the specific cocktail of relief and horror that is the exclusive property of parents who have located a missing child and immediately want to ground them until adulthood. "Minesio." "I found him," Minesio said, with the calm satisfaction of a navigator reporting a successful landing. "He fixed it." Soo-yeon looked at Jae-won. In 2 years, she had never been in a room with him. She had timed her cleaning around his schedule with the precision of an astronomer tracking an eclipse, close enough to observe, careful never to intersect. He was the kind of man whose existence restructured the atmosphere of whatever room he occupied, and she had always understood, without needing it explained, that women like her were not meant to intersect with men like him. And yet here they were. Intersected. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, and hated herself slightly for the reflex, the exact reflex Minesio had described with such quiet disappointment. "She apologizes to everyone even though we didn't do anything wrong."
"Don't," he said.
She stopped.
"She told me about that," he said.
The apologizing. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but its first cousin. She finds it inefficient. Soo-yeon looked at her daughter, who had finished the kimbap and was now swinging her legs off the edge of the enormous chair with the boneless ease of a child who had decided the room was hers. "She's not wrong," Soo-yeon said quietly. "No," Jae-won agreed. "She rarely seems to be." The city hummed behind the glass. Rain still falling, souls still blazing, the night still doing what nights in the city did, holding everything up to the light and waiting to see what was worth keeping. Soo-yeon reached for Minesio's hand. "We should go. I'm sorry for." "There is a position," Jae-won said, "in building administration. Days only. Better pay." He paused, which with him was its own form of punctuation. "If you want it, it's yours. No obligation." Soo-yeon stared at him. He looked back at her with the straight-faced patience of a man who had said what he meant and was comfortable waiting for the world to catch up. "Why?" she asked. He glanced at Minesio, who had found a paperweight on the side table and was examining it with forensic interest. "Because," he said simply, "she deserves a mother who isn't on her knees." The weeks that followed were, by any rational measure, impossible. And yet they happened anyway, the way impossible things tend to, quietly, incrementally, through a series of small, unremarkable moments that only reveal their significance in retrospect, when you line them up and realize they were not random at all. They were a direction. Soo-yeon started in building administration on a Thursday. Her desk was on the 12th floor, near a window that faced east, and it came with a chair that did not require rubber gloves to approach. Mr. Beck, her former supervisor, had shaken her hand on her last cleaning shift with the solemn dignity of a man passing a torch, and told her she was the best grout scrubber he had ever employed, which she accepted as the compliment it genuinely was. The work was different. Quieter in body, louder in mind, Schedules, access logs, vendor coordination, the 10,000 small administrative threads that kept a building like Shin Tower from unraveling. She was good at it. She was good at most things she decided to be good at, which was a quality she had never particularly advertised because there had never been anyone paying attention to advertise it to. She did not see J1 often. This was by design, hers and, she suspected, his. The 14th floor operated at a frequency she had no business tuning into, and she was practical enough to understand that the kindness he had extended on that rainy Tuesday was exactly that, kindness. A closed transaction. A man of his position did not make a habit of involving himself in the lives of the women who managed his building's vendor schedules. She told herself this on Monday. On Wednesday, his assistant called down to inform her that Minacio's school fees for the next semester had been settled anonymously, through a trust she had never heard of. She sat at her east-facing desk for a very long time after that call. She did not call up to the 14th floor. She did not send a message. She opened her administrative log, entered the day's vendor receipts, and breathed through the complicated architecture of emotion that had assembled itself in her chest without asking permission, gratitude and pride, and something more stubborn than either, a refusal to be a story that happened to her rather than one she was writing herself. That evening, she picked Minesso up from school, a thing she had never been able to do on Tuesdays, a thing she could do now every day, and they walked home through streets that smelled of rain and fried fish, and the particular soul dusk that turned everything amber for exactly 11 minutes before the neon took over. "Do you like the new job?" Miss O asked, holding her hand and stepping deliberately on every crack in the pavement, because she was 6 3/4 and the cracks deserved attention. "I do," Seon said. "Is the chair comfortable?" "Very." Minacio processed this with a nod of deep satisfaction. "Good. You have a bad back." I do not have a bad back. Mrs. Huang says you do. She says you walk like someone who has been apologizing to the floor for too long." Suyun opened her mouth, closed it, made a mental note to have a long conversation with Mrs. Huang about the appropriate scope of neighborly observation. "She's not wrong," she admitted. Minacio squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do that anymore." The apologizing. It was the same thing Jaewon had said. Word for word, tone for tone. The calm, declarative certainty of someone stating a fact rather than offering comfort. Suyun looked down at her daughter and felt something shift in her chest, tectonic and permanent. "When did you get so wise?" she asked. "I've always been wise," Minacio said. "You just work too many jobs to notice." On the 14th floor, Kong Jae-won was in the middle of a budget review when his head of security, Woo Sung-jin, a man of approximately zero sentimentality, who had once broken a man's collarbone without changing his coffee order, set a single sheet of paper on the desk. Jae-won looked at it. It was a hand-drawn picture, crayon on ruled notebook paper. A tall man in a black suit standing next to a woman, and a small girl with a large curly bun. The sky above them was dark blue. The city below was orange and gold. In the bottom right corner, written in the careful, deliberate capitals of a child who took handwriting seriously, "Thank you for being fair. Park Minacio, age 6 3/4. Sung-jin said nothing. He had learned over 4 years when silence was the correct response. Jaewon looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he folded it once, carefully, with the same hands that had signed contracts worth billions, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where he kept things that mattered. 3 months after a 6-year-old girl walked into the most dangerous office in Seoul and demanded justice with both pigtails and zero apology, the city was still raining. Not literally. Seoul had moved into a dry, brittle autumn that turned the ginkgo trees gold and sent their leaves across the pavements in slow, indifferent drifts. But in the world that Kong Jae-won occupied professionally, it was always raining. There was always a front moving in from somewhere, always a pressure system building at the edges of his territory, always someone somewhere who had decided that the space between his attention and his action was large enough to exploit. This time, it was Director Oh. Oh Tae-shik had left the 14th floor on that Tuesday night 3 months ago with his dignity moderately intact and a renegotiated territorial boundary that was, by any fair assessment, generous. Jae-won had been generous because he had been distracted, not a thing he would normally permit, but Mistress had been sitting in his chair eating kimbap and informing him that his office needed plants, and his concentration had not been entirely where it belonged. Had interpreted the generosity as weakness. This was the most common and most fatal mistake that men made about Kang Jae-won. They watched him be still and decided he was idle. They watched him be quiet and decided he was uncertain. They confused his restraint for limitation, the way people sometimes mistake a dam for a river and forget entirely about the water behind it. Had spent 3 months quietly consolidating, quietly expanding, quietly testing the borders of his new arrangement with the incremental boldness of a man who believed he was being subtle. He was not being subtle. He had simply not yet received confirmation that he had been observed. The confirmation arrived on a Tuesday. Jae-won chose Tuesday deliberately. He appreciated symmetry. The meeting was in the same room, the same table, the same arrangement of consequence, except this time there was no ambiguity about its purpose and no interruption scheduled. Arrived with 2 of his senior men, wearing the careful confidence of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. He had talking points. He had a counteroffer prepared. He had, in the parlance of men who mistake preparation for power, done his homework. Jae-won let him speak for exactly 4 minutes. Then he placed a single folder on the table. Inside were 3 months of documented transgressions, dates, locations, amounts, names, compiled with the thoroughness of people who had been watching the entire time and had simply been waiting for the folder to be thick enough to be definitive. Looked at the folder, then at Jae-won, then back at the folder, with the expression of a man who has just understood that the examination he thought he was administering was actually being administered to him. You have 2 options, Jae-won said. The first is a full reversal and a revised arrangement that reflects the fact that you have forfeited the goodwill of the original one. The second is not a business conversation. Chose the first option. He chose it in approximately 11 seconds, which was, Jae-won reflected, probably a personal record. That evening, Jae-won left the building at 7, early, by his standards, though early was relative when your standard was midnight. Sung-jin fell into step beside him at the elevator with the practiced seamlessness of a man who had timed his movements to his employers for 4 years. The park file, Jae-won said, without preamble. Sung-jin, who maintained files on everything because Jae-won occasionally asked about everything, did not miss a beat. Soo-yeon's performance reviews are excellent.
Consistently.
Building manager Lee says she has restructured the vendor schedule and saved approximately 8% on monthly operational costs. And Mistress. A pause. Barely a pause, but Sung-jin was a man of precise silences. Top of her class. Her teacher submitted a note last week describing her as, he consulted his phone, assertive, unusually principled, and occasionally exhausting. Jae-won said nothing for a moment. That tracks, he said. He did not plan to stop at the 12th floor. This was something he told himself with reasonable conviction as he stepped out of the elevator and continued telling himself with decreasing conviction as he walked the east corridor toward the administrative office and abandoned entirely when he found himself standing at the open door of a room where Soo-yeon was the last person still at her desk, working by the light of a single lamp, the city spreading gold and dark behind her through the east-facing window. She looked up. She did not startle. He noticed this, filed it away. Most people startled when he appeared in doorways. She simply looked up with the calm attentiveness of someone who had decided, at some prior point, not to be afraid of him. He wasn't entirely sure when she had decided this, but he found it. He searched for the word, restful. The way it was restful to be in a room where nothing was performing. Mr. Kang, she said. You're here late, he said. Quarterly vendor reconciliation. She gestured at the spreadsheet on her screen with the mild resignation of someone at peace with their workload. It has opinions. He looked at the spreadsheet, then at her. Then, because he was not a man who manufactured small talk and did not intend to start, he said, Have you eaten? She blinked. Yes. Earlier. Earlier is not the same as recently. She opened her mouth,
Closed it.
And then, because she was Park Soo-yeon and the reflex to simply agree and accommodate was one she had been actively dismantling for 3 months, she said, Are you asking me to dinner, Mr. Kang? The directness of it landed in the room like a coin dropped in a quiet space, small, clear, impossible to ignore. He held her gaze. I am asking you to finish your reconciliation, put on your coat, and allow me to buy you a meal in a restaurant where the chairs are comfortable and nobody will ask you to apologize for anything."
A beat.
"That's a very specific invitation," she said. "I'm a specific person." She looked at him for a long moment, the unhurried, clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned to look at things fully before deciding, because she no longer had the luxury of reversible decisions. He did not look away. He had not, he realized, been able to look away from Park Soo-yeon for approximately 3 months, which was itself a kind of data. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. The restaurant was quiet, small, tucked into a Gangnam side street that most people walked past without noticing, which was, Jae-won had always found, the best possible quality in a restaurant. They ate and talked, carefully at first, the way two people talk when they are both aware that the conversation is load-bearing, and then less carefully, and then not carefully at all. She told him about Mapo District, about the 3 jobs, about Min Seo's father, who had left before Min Seo was old enough to remember and who had therefore, in Min Seo's personal cosmology, simply never existed. She told him about ironing her uniform before night shifts because dignity does not take evenings off. She told him about Mrs. Huang's cat, Donut, who had recently learned to open the neighbor's refrigerator and was considered a neighborhood problem and a personal hero simultaneously. He told her things he did not, as a rule, tell people. About the weight of a name that had been handed to him before he was old enough to understand what carrying it would cost. About the difference between being powerful and being free, and how for a long time he had confused the two. About the fact that the drawing was in his jacket pocket.
Right now. Tonight.
She looked at him when he said that. "She'll want to know," Soo-yeon said softly, "that it matters to you." "It does," he said, simply, without architecture. The way he said things when he meant them without qualification. The city moved outside the window, indifferent and blazing, doing what Seoul always did, burning through the dark without apology. 3 weeks later, Min Seo informed Jae-won, during one of the Tuesday visits that had become, without formal announcement, a fixture of the week, that his office still needed plants. He had, by that point, acquired 2. A small potted fern near the window and a succulent on the desk that Min Seo had selected personally from a market in Mapo. Based on criteria she declined to explain, but applied with great seriousness. "Better," she said, examining them with the critical satisfaction of an interior decorator whose vision was finally being respected. Then she looked at him. "Are you going to be nice to my mum?" Jae-won, who had faced down syndicate bosses and government officials and men with considerably more leverage than a 6-year-old in a pinafore, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. Min Seo nodded once. Decisive. Final. The nod of someone closing a deal they have been negotiating for some time. "Okay then," she said. And she picked up the succulent, moved it 3 centimeters to the left, and declared the desk officially improved. Outside, Seoul burned gold and bright, the way it always did, indifferent to everything except the fact of its own light. And on the 14th floor of Shin Tower, for the first time in longer than anyone could measure, the most feared man in the city sat in his chair with plants on his windowsill and a crayon drawing against his heart, and felt, unmistakably, irrevocably, like a man who had been found. Not by power, not by strategy, by a 6-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat who had walked through the wrong door and accidentally opened the right one. Outside, Seoul burned gold and bright, the way it always did, indifferent to everything except the fact of its own light. And on the 14th floor of Shin Tower, for the first time in longer than anyone could measure, the most feared man in the city sat in his chair with plants on his windowsill and a crayon drawing against his heart, and felt, unmistakably, irrevocably, like a man who had been found. Not by power, not by strategy, by a 6-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat who had walked through the wrong door and accidentally opened the right one. And somewhere across the city, in a building she would never enter again, Shin Yuri was on the phone to Chiron explaining, for the 4th time that week, that it was really the child's fault. That the wine was expensive, that the blouse was silk, that she had done nothing any reasonable person wouldn't have done. Chiron, to her credit, had stopped agreeing. Because here's the thing about people like Yuri, they never run out of justifications. They will look a 6-year-old child in the face, raise their hand, and still find a way to be the victim of the story. They exist in every office, every building, every city, people who confuse proximity to power with the right to wield it against those who have none. Mistress didn't have power. She had something better. She had the nerve to walk into the room anyway. If you believe that no child, no person, should ever be made to feel small by someone who simply has more to lose from a stained blouse than a broken spirit, hit subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And drop a comment below. Tell us, would you have walked into that room? Only people who think Yuri was right won't.